Sejam bem-vindos a mais um podcast do Brasil Fintech. Hoje temos aqui autor nomeado, podcast famoso, futurista e investidor. Brett, welcome to Brasil Fintech, the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be on. I'm joining you from North Carolina today. So
I'm saying hi all the way, not from Brazil, unfortunately, from Copenhagen. But as we sit here, I was introducing you. Is it 7 books, Brett, now that we're on the number of already as an author?
Yeah. So one technically is an ebook. So, but yeah,
Okay.
and then I'm working on 3 new books at the moment. So,
Wow.
So we'll see when those come out.
And I was
But
sharing
hopefully
here
we'll get one out by the end of the year.
Okay, so we're going to 10 books. We have 3 award-winning, top-performing podcasts, The Breaking Banks, one with one of my dear friends, Matteo Rizzi in Europe, that you just continue to push the boundaries on. And if that wasn't enough,
we're just doing our 500th episode for Breaking Banks, which is our 10th anniversary. So that's actually happening next week. So that's pretty incredible.
That is amazing. Congratulations. I hope Brasil Fintech podcast and the community lives up to that. 500 episodes. That has to be a lot of stories around banks and fintech. So, Brett, let's start where you and I have maybe started meeting each other when you were still in your days of Movin, Braving Fintech, talking about technology transformation. At Brasil Fintech, we get really excited about practically, positively, and pragmatically, what is the impact of something like fintech in an economy like Brazil? That's why we wrote the book. That's why we started the project. That's why we're here. So you were there before this was like labeled fintech. You were there with Movin. You were there in the bundling and unbundling.
Exactly, yeah.
Some of your books talked about, the technology transformation of this. But I have a question for you. When was the first time, if you remember, that you realized this impact potential, real impact potential of fintech in humans and society?
Well, obviously, I had started writing Bank 2.0, my first book, in 2008. And so, but at the time, we weren't using the term fintech broadly. It had been coined by a UK reporter sometime earlier, but I think a few years before that. But that was mainly in reference to technology companies already working in the banking sector. So it wasn't really what fintech means today. Is largely around the startup world focused on fintech. But in 2008, when I started writing Bank 2.0, was published at the end, published in early 2010. By that stage, it was clear that, for me at least, as a futurist, that the internet and mobile were going to be game changers for the banking sector. But I was working at the time with HSBC, and HSBC and other big banks that I was working with were in denial that anything was going to be different. So I knew at that point that, if you like, a contentious change was coming, that it was going to be difficult for the industry to deal with this shift towards technology first banking, away from branch first banking. So I knew that. I think probably in 2001. But I think where it became really evident that we were in for a fight was near the end of the noughties.
And when that happened, when did you realize that people were going to care? Was the fight more of what the value service provision was going to be? That because back in the day, we're still talking about, one would call the beginnings of digital transformation and banking. And HSBC continues to be challenged in many areas with their global footprint, and some face some partial and denials. Some of the banks are still there. But when was the first time that you were realizing this could change people's lives? You've been, across the globe, not only with your speaking career, but talking about your books and learnings. When was that moment?
Well, the obvious thing was that as M-Pesa started in Africa, which was 2008 when it really started to get going. Within a couple of years after that, so, let's say 2010, 2011, we now had a proof point that the mobile phone, at least in the Kenyan market, could impact financial inclusion in a far greater way than branches ever had, most people in the space didn't sort of realize the importance of that. But if you look between 2011 and today, we've included, 1.4 billion people in the financial system in that period that have come into the financial system for the first time because of technologies like the mobile phone, not because of the branch. And so the really interesting piece of that is, if you look around Brazil now, LATAM with Nubank, with PixPay, you look at China with Alipay and WeChat Pay, India with Paytm, Bcash in Bangladesh, etc. You see that a real transformation has taken place in financial inclusion. And so that was fairly clear to me I knew the mobile phone was going to be a game changer. Financial inclusion, particularly by 2011, that was clearly the trajectory.
And when you looked at making that transformation and change, I think in seeing the technology, I think a lot of banks and largely the financial services industry gets confusingly distracted about which technology to, lash onto. You talked about some foundational ones like the internet and obviously the evolution of the mobile phone and the connectivity and just the enablement of infrastructure around it. When you looked at starting to veer towards your futurist career, technology is that path. What was some of the early on technologies that also caught your attention in that transition that was even perhaps more scary back then or now for the banks?
Well, in 2015, I wrote a book called Augmented Life in the Smart Lane. You can see it up on the shelf behind me there. And that was my effort to really talk about the fact that, technology was on this inexorable march, towards the future in terms of computers and artificial intelligence becoming infused in society in our life, and understanding that if you look back over the last 200 or 300 years, in terms of the impact of technology from the printing press really or from the steam engine, that human response or societal response to technology had largely been the same, which is when these technologies first appear in the early adopter phase, most people are like, it's never going to impact me, or it's never going to change the way we live. And it's not until, that you get up to a certain point of adoption where then people sort of jump on the bandwagon. And you've got, various stages, the fast followers and then the late adopters and so forth, the laggards, right? But the realization was that if you look at this historically at technological change, that it's actually been speeding up that whole time. And so now you have a situation where, for example, ChatGPT became the fastest ever, web application to reach 100 million users. And that's just happened in the last few months. So, you see now there's this, yeah, you see this compression happening, right? We call this in
Compression quantum time.
scientific. Right. We call it technology adoption diffusion, right? It's as more and more technology gets infused into our society, that we become more and more used to new technologies emerging. And so therefore the resistance and the adoption cycles are shortened. So I saw that trend, and I talked about that in Augmented, but it was really the fact that, we've become so reliant on technology, not just the use of our smartphone and day to day, but, we are going to be reliant on artificial intelligence to diagnose our medical conditions, to drive our vehicles, to running our calendars and our bank accounts and so forth. That we're not that far away from that type of technology immersion into what I call emerging smart economies or highly automated societies, and it's a pretty interesting time to be alive.
I know the Jetson cartoon never felt so close. I think that was one of the conversations we've had in the many offline chats. When you looked at this, was that what the trigger for becoming a futurist? I've been super lucky to meet some, and I can't help but to want to ask you a question. What is it like to be a futurist, and what do futurists do? What do you do with all this very, fast changing and never ending amounts of information?
Yeah. Well, you do have to really love this area to be a futurist, or you have to be passionate about the future. If you meet futurists, the one thing we all have in common is that we're in a hurry to get to the future. So I think that's the thing. But I would say I was always a futurist. Just the fact that I started writing as a futurist and sort of shifted from, if you look at my work in banking, I was being a bank futurist, right? Or a fintech futurist in that respect. So, my first book I actually wrote, which was never published, was a science fiction novel. So I wrote that when I was 25, and it was called Desert Fire, Mars 2035. It was about colonization of Mars and a terrorist coming to blow up a Mars research facility because it was developing a technology that would allow humanity to travel to the stars. So anyway, I grew up reading Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein and Asimov, and watching all the sci-fi I could, and being a futurist. Why it is a little bit weird. And I'm married to a futurist also, Miss Metaverse, Katie King. But why it's a little bit weird is that you view the world through this lens of how's it going to change the future, right? Most people, day to day, looking at news events and thinking about how's that going to impact them today, but in our household, we're like, oh, what does that mean for 20 years or 30 years time? So that's how you sort of spend your life. You view what's happening in society through this the future of society, where we're going to end up, and you basically have two potential outcomes on timelines, which is either a dystopian future or and so looking at developments of things that are happening in real time, you're saying, oh, well, that's shifting us more towards the dystopian outcomes. We've got to fix this, and then that sort of becomes the passionate part of it, at about trying to make sure we have the right messaging. Is this really the future we want?
How does it go from making it scary to finding people some safety in that change? Because as you said, it wasn't, humans are inherently not super comfortable around change. And I don't think much has changed about that since 2008. We kind of got forced into our rooms. But if you really look at it, I wonder, how do you navigate? So you've been helping large companies speaking all across the globe. So for people out there in the ecosystem in Brazil and in Latin America listening, what are some of those, maybe tools or frameworks that you help people navigate and understanding, is this the future we really want? I look at
Right.
it, things are burning, New York looks scary,
I
India
know.
is melting, right? Where do we start? So
Well,
how does it not get so
yeah, I mean, I do think you can, of course, read stories and watch stories that give you some potential view of the future based on the current trajectory. So a couple of good examples of that are there's an Apple TV series called Extrapolations.
really
Katie and I
great one?
both watched it, and and it's a very realistic, potential view of the future, and it's a scary view. It's one where corporations set policy globally, and they decide when we will respond to climate change and how, because they are so wealthy that they have such control over, the political environment, and you see that reflected in the extinction of species, wildfires around the planet, etc. Another good example is Kim Stanley Robinson's latest book, Ministry of the Future. He's one of our greatest living science fiction authors today, but he's probably one of the world's best climate science fiction authors. So really, really interesting perspective. So you have to make people aware of where this goes, and most people can't think exponentially. They can't extrapolate. So they look at something like ChatGPT right now and they'll say, but it's not taking any jobs. I don't see it. I don't see AI taking jobs. You talk about this, but it's not real to me because I'm looking at ChatGPT and it's not good enough to take jobs. But what they can't see is, the 60 years of AI development that we've had and where that's taken us today and where that's going to take us in the future in terms of disruption. So I think the main thing that I sort of try and do in my career is help people learn to do that sort of exponential, extrapolative thinking, is help them understand where we go in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and just to think like a futurist. And that's why I started my most recent podcast. It's been going for over a year now, but it's called The Futurists, where we interview, different futurists and people working on and building the technologies and science of the future for that reason, to help people understand that this is the trajectory that humanity is on, and we have certain choices that we have to make over the next few years that are going to impact the outcome.
I often think about, as an entrepreneur and a dreamer too, not perhaps as into sci-fi, but into arts and math and science. I think I've always been sort of curious, Brett, in realizing the connection between the now and, our human usual incapacity of being present, which usually takes acknowledging the state of affairs of what is. And having been in digital transformation and digital identity, which is like such a huge portion of that 1.4 billion people being included as like a path, I've often find that where the trouble starts is in our lack of ability to acknowledge what is and take account of this sort of now. And then extrapolating that to the future then just becomes, a terrifying exercise. So it's better to just almost be continuously busy about the current buzzword or, easy judgment of AI shall be bad or shall be good. And I think
that's part of human nature, that we don't want to think about the bad stuff, and so we and we ignore things that are staring us right in the face, in terms of their impact. When we look today at fossil fuels as an example, and there's you see this
Once irrelevant to Brazil.
yeah, you see this protracted debate over whether or not man-made climate change is real, or whether it is just a natural cycle of the climate. But of course, that messaging has been carefully crafted by the fossil fuel industry over decades, right? To keep their industry.
So I was going to say, sounds similar to that Apple TV show, not so far from the future, around corporations.
No, absolutely. And so you do see that, and these corporations can spend huge amounts of money on getting messaging out there, and so and you will see, particularly in countries like the United States, to some extent Brazil as well, wholehearted defense of these corporations, almost. And capitalism is, don't think that Christianity is the number one religion in the United States. Capitalism is the number one religion in the United States, because people are so entrenched in their beliefs about this, right? But when you look at the facts, 7 to 10 million people die every year from pollution-related injuries and diseases, right? From conditions related to putting hydrocarbons in the atmosphere around cities in particular. We've known this since the 1970s. We could have developed green technologies. We could have been completely green as a society globally by the year 2000 if we'd set our if we'd set our hearts as a society or communities on changing away from fossil fuel, burning for energy, back in the 1970s, when we knew what it was going to do. In fact, we knew earlier, potentially. Why didn't we? Because the market was making a ton of money out of fossil fuel hydrocarbons. And that is human nature. Our human nature is to look at the short-term financial benefits that we can eke out of this, and we'll worry about the rest later. But that is, as is evidenced by the death toll associated with hydrocarbons, it takes a very heavy toll on humanity. So I think it is at some point over the next 20 to 30 years that climate change in particular, but artificial intelligence also, will make us awaken as a species, where we have to set new priorities. It is a philosophical shift that humanity has to go through.
Yeah, and one that just talks about foundational values and the things that we value.
Right. What's important for humanity as a species? How do we? This is sort of the meaning of life, right? And in my book, The Rise of Technosocialism, I get into Aristotelian philosophy. What is the nature of humanity, and what is the purpose of life? And Aristotle had a fairly simple view, which was that humanity's purpose is to thrive, to grow and to gain understanding, and to use that to improve as a species, to evolve and become better. But to do that, also the realization was humanity must work together. And that's, we are so tribal, and, in the States, you're either, blue or red, a Democrat or Republican, you're the people on the other political side are your sworn mortal enemies, that sort of stuff. Even when it comes to soccer teams, we get very tribal, for example, with our football and things. And that is, an artifact of human evolution of thousands of years of programming, that, you have to compete for resources as a tribe. And that, that we have to really sort of break that cycle, so that we, ultimately humans in the second half of the 21st century are either going to be going extinct or we will have learned to work together better. That's really sort of the binary option. I know it sounds probably scary, but the more divided we are, the more we compete against each other. And this is why capitalism is such a problem for the future of humanity. That we need to learn to compete for each other, not against each other. And until we do that, until we learn to use technology, science, economics and so forth for the benefit of all humans, then ultimately the risk to the species is extremely high.
Yeah, and have no fighting chance. I often talk about this in your binary scenario, which, it is scary, but is the reality of what we accept. In the binary one, where we don't all end up extinct, some of the ones that do have a control on something that looks like disparity of access, disparity of education, right, and understanding. Brazil is a country that has historically had narratives of prejudice and slavery and lots of resources not being understood. And I wouldn't particularly say the country is well known for working together for the greater good of the planet or of its people. So without sounding too pessimistic here and looking at the positive of this, when you think of Brazil, you've just recently been there. You think of this with some positive eyes, and you have to maybe share some of the views that we often think here at Brasil Fintech, and I share in my work with UNESCO in AI and sustainability, is we have a massive, not only responsibility with our footprint, geographically speaking, but also an opportunity to lead
absolutely.
And, mobile connectivity and agro businesses and reforestation and taking care of technologies around our ocean and things like blue carbon. There's lots of really interesting uses. What have you come back from Brazil mostly sort of perhaps excited about in a positive future in 20, 30 years? What can you see possible?
Well, I've been going to Brazil for many years. My first visit to Brazil was in 2006 as part of the United Nations Development Program, where I spoke at a conference in Sao Paulo. That trip, I actually, I was in Sao Paulo. I've got my pilot's license, so I ended up hiring a plane with a local pilot, and we flew down the coast to Ubatuba.
Nice.
And landed on the beach. For me, that was eye-opening because the archipelago, the coastline, it's just so beautiful. One thing is clearly Brazil has such biodiversity that is so important and such beauty, and the other thing that is really a healthy element of Brazilian business is if you look at creativity. Brazil as an economy is, if you look at design agencies and so forth, Brazil has some of the most highly regarded design teams in the world, frankly, in terms of visual design and so forth, right? So if you put those two things together, plus a vibrant young population, that is coming up, the opportunity to make really important change around sort of what Kim Stanley Robinson calls eco-economics, and the fact that we're building an economic system that is sustainable and more prosperous. Brazil would be a great cultural center for that, in terms of let's think creatively about how we can really make the world a better place and come up with new value systems and things like that. Brazil could be definitely a part of that, I think.
Yeah, I only see us being able to lead on when I look at all the innovation and not only the massive sort of unicorns and opportunity that has had, just our ability to adopt a technology. We're a very social and connected country. I think some of those things around, the adoption and the fusion curve that you talked about could be in our favor. When you think about
Yeah.
this, what do you think needs to happen? You've seen some ecosystems really thrive. You spend some time in Asia as well as in the US with like a home back and forth here. What are some of the ingredients that, we should be looking at outwardly instead of just inwardly, which Latin American countries sometimes tend to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think.
Okay, yeah, I made it. One good question.
No. No, I think we looked at four potential futures in technosocialism, and the way we divided the potential futures of humanity was basically around two axes, right? One axis was where we have a more planned future versus a chaotic future that just sort of happens and evolves. And the other was over economies that are individualistic focused, like the US economies, and my increasingly my home country of Australia. And the UK as an example, versus more collective economies like, the Nordic regions, China, and so forth, where the emphasis is more on social policy and collective policy. And if you look at these sort of two arcs over the next 30 years, then you really do get into sort of this philosophical divide as to whether or not we're making policy decisions which are, of benefit to humanity as a whole, or just benefit a very small portion of humanity that own the resources that set policy, right? So the corporations and the lobby groups and so forth that have control over politics. And I am hopeful change occurring there, where our children, by the time that they're setting policy, by the time they're in government, that they will be saying, what has capitalism brought us? It's brought us climate change. It's brought us, artificial scarcity, inequality. Inequality is a massive problem today. It's, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, says of the United States that it has greater inequality of any modern nation of any time throughout history. Like you have to really go back to the Middle Ages before the Black Plague to find inequality of the level we see in the United States today. And historically that results in revolution, right? So what sort of revolution are we going to have to solve the problem of inequality? Well, if you would tie that in with, sustainability for climate and so forth, we could have a sea change in policy where we're saying, all right, how do we, and think about the fact that by the mid 2040s, we're going to have a massive eco-refugee problem. The estimates are wide-ranging, but they range from 300 million to 1.6 billion eco-refugees. These are people displaced by lack of access to food, by sea level rise, by severe weather conditions, and so forth. Right, and if you look at that, and you look at the tools that we have in the toolkit today. Let's say 1 billion people. Let's say halfway in the estimate.
Let's just say a little piece of India.
Right. So over 10% of the world's population at risk from extinction or death because of policy. It's and the argument we would have today, which you can see played out in markets like the US, is, well, who's going to pay for that, right? And I think that's a false equivalency, that we can put a dollar value on human lives like that. At some point, over the next 30 years, we are going to have to come to the realization that money is not as important as the existence of humanity. Right. That it is just a tool, and that our, the economic models that we built need to evolve. People that get so passionate about capitalism and so defensive of it and say it's the best system we've ever come up with. My answer to that is, in 10,000 years, do you think it will be the best system we've ever been able to imagine for humanity? Right. And the answer, of course, to that is simple. It's like, no.
Yeah,
right?
of course not.
Most people will agree that, oh no, we'll probably come up with something better. Then obviously the next line of thinking is, well, why can't we do that today? Why wait for 10,000 years, right? And so if you look at the value systems that we need for humanity to thrive, coming back to Aristotle in philosophy, we need to start looking at how is it what are the organizing principles for society that give us the best options for all of humanity, not just for a very small percentage of humanity. And like if you look during the pandemic, the wealth of the world's billionaires surpassed $10 trillion for the first time, and 150 million people around the world slipped into extreme poverty because of the pandemic. In the United States, you have today 30 million people facing potential eviction over the next 18 months because they can't afford to make rent. You have people making decisions in the United States ill, or they have an insulin shot for their diabetes condition. 2/3 of all bankruptcies in the United States are healthcare related bankruptcies. So this is a situation which shouldn't exist, right? We shouldn't have to make a decision as to whether we have our next meal or whether we get healthcare, as an example. This is evidence of a broken system where the priorities are wrong.
I couldn't agree more. I think that requires a rewiring, this level of awareness, the level of changing narrative that is unprecedented. And I think it's interesting to see the things that we're ultimately afraid of and the things we've learned how to prioritize and optimize for. I think we still live in a world of idolizing those trillionaires that came out. And
Right.
those are the people that have made it and have shown us all what abundance is really meant to be about. So I think until the world of that,
I mean, in
techno-socialism,
in techno-socialism, we actually propose that there is a cap on wealth of billionaires, because we do predict, we did predict in the book that the first trillionaire will probably be Elon Musk, if it's not Bezos or, Jack Ma was another potential, but the Chinese government sort of shut that down more recently. But Elon, with Starlink could be the world's first trillionaire. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, you've seen illustrations of how ridiculous this is. If you were born at the dawn of man and you earned $10,000 a day, you still wouldn't have as much money as Elon has today. So this is sort of a little bit ridiculous that we have such concentrated wealth in the hands of these billionaires. And as you say, we idolize them. It's a very inefficient method of resource allocation. And of course, Musk argues that billionaires are able to use those resources more efficiently than other humans. But that is not really a valid argument when you have such deep inequality. So in techno-socialism, we basically said, well, maybe we cap it at 100 million or, 300 million or let's say $500 million, we'll let you have $500 million, but it doesn't, because at that point you can still do whatever you need to do, in terms of that, and the rest needs to go into social causes or whatever. Now, I can hear some people already on the podcast saying, oh, that's unreasonable. Why limit the potential of this? But, I do think, or even if it's 100 billion, let's say $100 billion, right? The reality is, how, you can capture all of this wealth, but if you want to have prosperous societies where humanity as a whole is prosperous, then you need to have better distribution of wealth. And that's the problem we have right now, is the current system results in the concentration of wealth in a very small pool of resources. There are 8 people in the world today that own more wealth than half of the planet. Right. In the United States, the billionaires, the the top 0.1% of Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. And that history teaches us is a untenable position. It doesn't last, and it creates, great fracturing in society. So it's not an efficient way for society to operate, and it's not an efficient way to allocate resources.
So maybe one day we can look at all of this and rely on technology to teach us efficiency, take some emotion and put the data into the faces of the ones that maybe don't understand. I certainly share and sit in hope. That's why we started, Jihani, Mariska and I, Brasil Fintech, not only the community and the podcast, and understanding that some of the things like financial technology could maybe set people free. Some of these enablements. And I spent certainly a ton of time in the side of the camp around crypto and Web3 applications and understanding what could this really look like if decentralization actually took place, if accountability and traceability took shape, and we can, call a spade and realize that when we make lines in the sand, we don't really make lines in the air, and people still, die. And
I think all of that is very valid. I think it's time for humanity to grow up, and I think I think climate change will force that to happen. I don't think people understand how big of an impact climate change is going to have. In 1,000 years' time, the biggest thing humanity will be talking about will be, what we did with the climate and the emergence of artificial intelligence. And, we won't be talking about Trump. We won't be talking about Bolsonaro. We won't be talking about any of these sort of micro issues that we have. We won't be talking about transgenderism or anything like that. We'll be talking about the impact that climate and AI had on our society, because there'll be such game changers. So, that's, we have a catalyst for change coming. I do believe that.
If you were to leave anybody in here with the Brasil Fintech community a little piece of advice into maybe looking after their own future in this messy but exciting world ahead, what would that be, Brett? You've had an incredible career and you're a superstar to most, and certainly a pleasure to me to have in this podcast. So what do you leave our community with?
Life is precious, and I think we have to get up every day and think about how we can make the world a better place as individuals, and together we can do that. And if we have that as a priority rather than, how am I going to put food on the table, which is a very real concern for a lot of people. I recognize that. But, if we can focus more on how collectively we can make the world a better place, then we will. That will be the outcome. So I think that that's part of that cultural shift. There's a Japanese concept called ikigai, which sort of encapsulates this, that not only can you find something you're good at that you can get paid for, but something that really can do good in the world. And I think we now need to start to reframe professions and corporations and so forth about, what are you contributing to the whole? And in the 2030s, because of technology unemployment, because of artificial, that has come as a result of artificial intelligence, because of the emerging climate issues, you're going to start to see a shift where corporations that are massively profitable are not valued as highly as corporations that are really, fixing the problems in the world and doing things that are good for humanity. I do think there's going to be a shift in terms of the way we think about corporate actors being good corporate actors or not. And I think that's part of this sort of philosophical shift. But I would just say to people, just start thinking about how you can make a difference and try and make a little bit of a difference every day. And, we will all end up in a better place if we all do that together. I guess let me leave you with this one thought. The only way we get to a utopian, positive future for humanity is if we work together.
And with that, I can only be grateful for working with you and having had your advice on me following my passion around identity throughout the years. And thank you for being here and inspiring our community and being practical, positive, and pragmatic about our future and what it holds, Brett. I will switch to Portuguese. Obrigada a todos por escutarem
Obrigado.
aqui. Nosso... Obrigada, Brett. Seja bem-vindo mais uma vez e muito obrigada pela sua presença. Voltamos com você já no próximo episódio de Brasil Fintech. Meu nome é Bianca e mais uma vez, obrigada.